You will then go to the woods of Cuzban, which is 1 league from Plormel. Make the call of the owl. A man will come, out of a hole. It will be Thuo, seneschal of Plormel, who has belonged to what is called the Constitution Assembly, but on the good side. Tell him to arm the castle of Cuzban, belonging to the Marquis de Guerre, a refugee. Then go to St. Gouin les Toits, and speak to Jean Chouan, who is, in my eyes, the real chief. Then go to the woods of Ville Anglos, where you will see Gitter, called St. Martin. Tell him to have an eye for a certain Cormenil, son-in-law of old Goupil de Préfilm, and who leads the Jacobins of Argentan. Remember all this well. I write nothing because nothing must be written. ... Then go to the woods of Rochefeu, where Mielet is, who leaps ravines, balancing himself on a long pole. I jump ahead 3 whole pages. Go to Saint Mahervé. There you will see Gaulier, called Grand Pierre. Go to the district of Parnay, where the men blacken their faces. Go to the camp of La Vache Nore, which is on a height, in the midst of the wood of La Charny, then to the camp of Lavoine, then to Champ Vert, then to Champ des Fourmis. Go to the Grand Bordage, also called the Haut du Pré, which is inhabited by a widow whose daughter is married to Tredon, called the Englishman. The Grand Bordage is in the parish of Caslaines. You must go to Epinay-le-Chevreuil, Sillé-le-Guillaume, Perrons, and all the men in every wood. And so on to the final exchange. Forget nothing. Have no fear. Start now. God be with you. Go. I will do all you have told me. I will go. I will speak the word. I will obey. I will command. Book 3, Chapter 2. It is, of course, impossible for Halmalo to remember everything, and the reader is fully aware of it. 1 line later, we have already forgotten the names on the previous line. The list is tedious, but it has to be read and reread. It is like music. Pure sound. It could be an index of names at the back of an atlas, but this frenzy of cataloging makes the Vendée into an infinity. The technique of the list is an ancient one. The catalogue becomes useful when something has to appear so immense and confused that a definition or description would be insufficient to show its complexity, especially to give the feeling of a space and all it contains. The list or catalogue does not fill up a space, which in itself would be neutral, with significant phenomena, associations, facts, details that catch the eye. It brings together objects or people or places. It is a hypotyposis which creates a description through an excess of flatus vocis, as if the ear had given the eye part of the impossible task of memorizing everything it hears, or as if the imagination was striving to construct a place in which to put all the things named. The list is a Braille hypotyposis. Nothing is inessential in the list that Halmalo is pretending, I hope, to remember. Altogether it represents the very enormousness of the counter-revolution, its extension throughout the land, into the hedgerows, villages, woods, and parishes. Hugo knows every ploy, as well as being aware, as perhaps Homer also was, that readers would never read the whole list, or that those listening to the ancient bard would have listened in the same way that people listen to the recital of the Rosary, yielding to its pure captivating incantation. Hugo, I am sure, knew that his reader would have skipped these pages, as Manzoni did when, contrary to every rule of narrative, he leaves us in suspense with Don Abbondio faced by 2 villains, and then gives us 4 pages about local laws and edicts, 4 in the 1840 edition, but almost 6 in the 1827 edition. The reader skips over these pages, or might perhaps look at them on a second or third reading, but we cannot ignore the fact that the list is there before our eyes, forcing us to jump ahead as the suspense is unbearable. It is its unbearableness that amplifies its power. Returning to Hugo, the insurrection is so enormous that we, while reading it, cannot remember all the main characters, or even just their leaders. It is the compunction of this prolonged reading that makes us feel the sublimity of the Vendée. The royalist revolt is sublime, as must be the picture of the convention, the very essence of the revolution. We reach the 3rd book, titled, The Convention. The first 3 chapters describe the hall, and already in these first 7 pages the abundance of description leaves the reader dazed and deprived of all feeling of space. But it then continues, for another 15 pages, with the list of the members of the convention, more or less as follows. On the right, the Gironde, a legion of thinkers, on the left the Mountain, a group of athletes. On one side, Buisson, who received the keys of the Bastille, Barbaroux, whom the Marseille troops obeyed, Kerveligan, who had the battalion of Brest garrison in the Faubourg Saint-Marceau, under his hand, Gersonet, who established the supremacy of representatives over generals. Sillery, the humpback of the right, as Couthon was the cripple of the left. Laus de Perret, who when called a rascal by a journalist, invited him to dine with him, saying, I know that rascal means simply a man who does not think as we do. Ribaut Saint-Étienne, who commenced his almanac of 1790 with these words, the revolution is ended. Vaget, who had the title of grenadier in the 2nd Battalion of Mayenne et Loire, who, when threatened by the public tribunes, cried out, I ask that at the first murmur of the public tribunes, we withdraw and march to Versailles, sword in hand. Bouzeau, destined to die of hunger. Valazé, victim of his own dagger. Condorcet, who was to die at Bourg-la-Reine, changed to Bourg-Égalité, denounced by the horse he carried in his pocket. Pétion, whose fate was to be worshipped by the multitude in 1792, and devoured by the wolves in 1793. 20 others beside, Pontécoulant, Marbos, Leyden, Saint-Martin, Dessau, the translator of Juvenal, who took part in the campaign of Hanover, Boileau, Bertrand, Lester Beauvais, Lesage, Gomer, Gardien, Mainvielle, Duplancher, Lacaze, Antiboul, and at their head a barnave called Verganayo. And so on, for 15 pages, like the Litany of a Black Mass, Antony Louis Léon Florel de Saint-Just, Merlin de Thionville, Mercan de Douai, Biot Varenne, Fabre d'Églantine, Fréron Thersites, Osselin, Guérin Coulon, Javogues, Camboulas, Collet, Derbois, Goupilot, Laurent Lecointre, Léonard Bourdouin, Bourbet, Levasseur de la Sarthe, Riverchon, Bernard de Sainders, Charles Richard, Chateauneuf-Randon, Lavacomterie, Le Pelletier de Saint-Fargeau, almost as if Hugo realized that anyone reading this mad catalogue would have lost the identity of the actors in order to become aware of the titanic dimensions of the only actant he was interested in, the revolution itself, with its glories and its miseries. Yet it seems that Hugo, was it due to weakness, shyness, excessive excess, is worried that the reader, even though he presumably skips ahead, will not fully grasp the dimensions of the monster he wishes to portray, and so, using an entirely new technique in the history of the list, and in any case different from the description of the Vendée, the author's moralizing voice continually intervenes at the beginning, at the end, in the list itself. Here is the convention. The attention must be fixed on this summit. Never did anything higher appear on man's horizon. There is Mount Himalaya, and there is the convention. The convention is the first avatar of the people. The effect of all this was intense, savage, regular. Savage correctness. This is a suggestion of the whole revolution. Nothing was more deformed, nor more sublime. A pile of heroes, a herd of cowards. Wild beasts on a mountain, reptiles in a marsh. A gathering of titans. Tragedies knotted by giants and untied by dwarfs. Minds, a prey to the wind. But this wind a miraculous wind. Such was this boundless convention, an entrenched camp of the human race attacked by all the powers of darkness at once, the night fires of a besieged army of ideas, the immense bivouac of minds on the edge of a precipice. Nothing in history can be compared to this gathering, both Senate and populace, conclave and street crossing, Areopagus and public square, tribunal and the accused. The convention always yielded to the wind, but the wind came from the mouth of the people and was the breath of God. It is impossible not to give attention to this great procession of shades. Section 2, Book 3, Chapter 1. Unbearable? Unbearable. Bombastic? Much worse. Sublime? Sublime. See how I am being swept away by my author and have even begun to speak like him. But when bombast bursts its banks, breaks down the wall of the sound of excessive excess, a hint of poetry begins to form. Ellas. Authors, unless they are writing with no interest in money and no hope of immortality, for a readership of seamstresses, traveling salesmen, or lovers of pornography whose tastes at that specific time and in one given country are well known, never write for their own specific kind of reader but try to construct a model reader. In other words, the kind of reader who, having accepted from the beginning the rules of the textual game on offer, will become the ideal reader of that book, even 1,000 years later. What kind of model reader is Hugo thinking of? I think he had two kinds in mind. The first was someone reading in 1874, 80 years after the fateful year of 1793, someone who still knew many of the names of the convention. It would be like someone in Italy today reading a book about the 1920s, who would not be taken completely by surprise at the sight of names like Mussolini, D'Annunzio, Marinetti, Facta, Corradoni, Matteotti, Papini, Boccioni, Cara, Italo Balbo, or Turati. The second kind is the future reader, or perhaps even the foreign reader of Hugo's time, who, with the exception of a few names like Robespierre, Danton, and Marat, would have been bewildered in the face of so many unfamiliar names. But at the same time, he would have the impression of listening to endless tittle-tattle about the village he is visiting for the first time and where he gradually learns to separate himself from the crowd of contradictory figures, to sniff the atmosphere, to become accustomed little by little to moving about in that crowded arena where he imagines that each unknown face is a mask hiding a story of bloodshed and is, ultimately, one of the many masks of history. As I have said, Hugo is not interested in the psychology of his wooden or marmoreal characters. He is interested in the antonomasia to which they relate or, if you like, their symbolic value. The same applies for things. For the forests of the Vendée or for La Tourgue, the immense Tour Gauvain in which Lantenac is besieged by Gauvain, both men attached to the ancestral fortress that both will try to destroy, one laying siege from outside and the other besieged within, each threatening a final holocaust. Much has been written about the symbolic value of this tower, not least because another innocent symbolic gesture takes place in it. The destruction of a book by the three children. The children are hostages of Lantenac, who threatens to blow them up if the Republicans try to set them free. They are locked in the library of the besieged tower and have nothing better to do than destroy, transforming a magnificent book about St. Bartholomew into a pile of paper fragments. And there are those who see in their gesture the reenactment, in reverse, of the night of St. Bartholomew, carried out to the shame of the monarchy of the time, and therefore perhaps a revenge of history, a childish antistrophe of that work of annihilating the past that is being carried out elsewhere by the guillotine. What is more, the title of the chapter that narrates this story is The Massacre of St. Bartholomew. Hugo was always worried his readers weren't quaking quite enough. But this gesture, due to its excess, can also be seen as symbolic. The children's games are described in every detail for 15 pages, and it is thanks to this excess that Hugo warns us that we are not dealing even here with an individual story but with the tragedy of an actant innocence, which is at least benevolent if not redemptive. He could obviously have resolved everything in a sudden epiphany. That he was capable of doing so can be seen in the last lines of Book 3, Chapter 6. Little Georgette picks up handfuls of the book assigned to that sacred sparagmos, throws them from the window, sees them being scattered in the breeze, and says, "Papillons," and the ingenuous massacre ends with these butterflies disappearing into thin air. But Hugo could not weave this very brief epiphany into the plot of so many other excesses at the risk of it going unnoticed. If excess is to exist, even the most dazzling numinous apparitions, contrary to every mystical tradition, have to last for a very long time. In 93, even charm must appear murky, like a froth of white-hot lava, waters spilling forth, inundations of affections and of effects. It is pointless asking Wagner to reduce his entire ring to the size of a Chopin scherzo. So as not to allow our author to take over, let us move on finally to the end. After a truly epic battle, what a great screenwriter Hugo would have made. Gauvain finally captures Lantenac. The duel is over. Chimordain has no hesitation and, even before the trial, gives orders for the guillotine to be set up. Killing Lantenac would mean killing the Vendée, and killing the Vendée would mean saving France. But Lantenac, as I revealed at the beginning, has voluntarily given himself up to save the 3 children who were in danger of being burned to death in the library to which he alone had the key. In the face of this gesture of generosity, Gauvain does not have the heart to send the man to his death, and saves him. Hugo uses other rhetorical devices to compare 2 worlds, first in the dialogue between Lantenac and Gauvain, and then in the dialogue between Chimordain and Gauvain, who at that point awaits his death. In Lantenac's first invective against Gauvain, before realizing he was going to save him, he expresses all the arrogance of the ci devant before the representative of those who have guillotined the king. In the confrontation between Chimordain and Gauvain, a deep gulf appears between the high priest of vengeance and the apostle of hope. "I would like man to be made according to Euclid," says Chimordain, and Gauvain replies that he would like man to be made according to Homer. The whole novel suggests to us, in stylistic terms, that Hugo would have taken Homer's part, which is why he fails to make us loathe his Homeric Vendée, but in ideological terms this Homer has tried to tell us that to build the future it is necessary to follow the straight line of the guillotine. This is the story told in the novel, the story of Hugo's stylistic choices, the story of one interpretation, my own, and others are possible. What can we say? That historians have identified many anachronisms and unacceptable liberties in this book? Does that matter? Hugo wasn't interested in writing history, he wanted us to feel the panting breath, the often fetid roar of history. Did he want to deceive us, like Marx, who claimed that Hugo was more interested in the moral conflicts of individual people than in understanding the class struggle? 6. If anything, it was the opposite, and he said so. Hugo carves his psychological portraits with a hatchet to make us feel the forces in conflict, and if it wasn't class conflict that he was thinking about, it was certainly, as Lukács recognized, the ideals of a revolutionary democracy that point the way ahead. Though Lukács then tempered his judgment with the stern warning that the real human and historical conflicts of the aristocrat and the priest who sided with the revolution become, for each of them, artificial conflicts of duty in the context of this abstract humanism. 7. Heavens above, it has even been suggested that Hugo was not interested in class but in the people and in God. It was typical of Lukács's mental rigidity that he failed to understand that Hugo could not be Lenin. If anything, Lenin was a Chimordain who doesn't kill himself. And that indeed the tragic and romantic magic of 93 lies in the interplay between the reasons of history and those of various moral individuals, measuring the constant divide between politics and utopia. But I believe there is no better book for understanding the underlying motives of the revolution and of its enemy, the Vendée, which is an ideological force even today for so many nostalgics of La France profonde. To tell the story of 2 excesses, Hugo, faithful to his poetics, could choose only the technique of excess, taken from excess. Only by accepting this convention is it possible to understand the convention, becoming the model reader that Hugo had hoped to reach, made not with flimsy cardboard cutouts but with an opus incertum of rough-hewn boulders. If we enter into the spirit that animates this novel, we may come out dry-eyed but with our minds in tumult. Ella's, previously unpublished in this form, this essay summarizes various articles and lectures. Censorship and silence. Those of you who are younger may think that Valine are pretty girls who dance about on television shows, and that a casino is a chaotic mess. 1. Anyone of my generation knows that the word casino used to mean brothel, and only later, by connotation, did it come to mean somewhere chaotic, so that it lost its initial meaning, and today anyone, perhaps even a bishop, uses it to indicate disorder. Likewise, once upon a time a bordello was a brothel, but my grandmother, a woman of the most upright morals, used to say, "Don't make a bordello," meaning, don't make too much racket. The word had completely lost its original meaning. The younger ones among you may not know that, during the fascist regime, Valine were sheets of paper that the government department responsible for controlling culture, called the Ministry of Popular Culture, shortened to Min-Culpop. They didn't have sufficient sense of humor to avoid such an ambiguous-sounding name, sent to the newspapers. These sheets of thin copy paper told the newspapers what they had to keep quiet about and what they had to print. The Valina, in journalistic jargon, therefore came to symbolize censorship, the inducement to conceal, to make information disappear. Point 2. The Veline that we know today, the television showgirls, are, however, the exact opposite. They are, as we all know, the celebration of outward appearance, visibility, indeed of fame achieved through pure visibility, where appearance signifies excellence, even that kind of appearance that would once have been considered unseemly. We find ourselves with two forms of Velina, which I would like to compare with two forms of censorship. The first is censorship through silence, the second is censorship through noise. I use the word Velina, therefore, as a symbol of the television event, the show, entertainment, news coverage, and so on. Fascism had understood, as dictators generally do, that deviant behavior is encouraged by the fact that the media give it coverage. For example, the Veline used to say, "Don't write about suicide, because the mere mention of suicide might inspire someone to commit suicide a few days later." This is absolutely correct. We shouldn't assume all that went through the minds of the fascist hierarchy was wrong. And it is quite true that we know about events of national significance that have occurred only because the media have talked about them. For example, the student protests of 1977 and 1989. They were short-lived events that sought to repeat the protests of 1968 only because the newspapers had begun saying, 1968 is about to return. Anyone involved in those events knows perfectly well that they were created by the press, in the same way that the press generates revenge attacks, suicides, classroom shootings. News about one school shooting provokes other school shootings, and a great many Romanians have probably been encouraged to rape old ladies because the newspapers told them it is the exclusive speciality of immigrants and is extremely easy to commit. All you have to do is loiter in any pedestrian passage, near a railway station, and so forth. If the old-style Velina used to say, to avoid causing behavior considered to be deviant, don't talk about it, the Velina culture of today says, to avoid talking about deviant behavior, talk a great deal about other things. I have always taken the view that if, by some chance, I discovered that tomorrow's newspapers were going to take up some wrong I had committed that would cause me serious harm, the first thing I'd do would be plant a bomb outside the local police headquarters or railway station. The next day the newspaper front pages would be full of it and my personal misdemeanor would end up as a small inside story. And who knows how many real bombs have been planted to make other front page stories disappear. The example of the bomb is sonically appropriate, as it is an example of a great noise that silences everything else. Noise becomes a cover. I would say that the ideology of this censorship through noise can be expressed, with apologies to Wittgenstein, by saying, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must talk a great deal. The flagship TG1 news program on Italian state television, for example, is a master of this technique, full of news items about calves born with two heads and bags snatched by petty thieves. In other words, the sort of minor stories papers used to put low on an inside page, which now serve to fill up 3/4 of an hour of information, to ensure we don't notice other news stories they ought to have covered have not been covered. Several months ago, the press controlled by Berlusconi, in order to undermine the authority of a magistrate who criticized the premier, followed him for days, reporting that he sat smoking on a bench, went to the barber, and wore turquoise socks. To make a noise, you don't have to invent stories. All you have to do is report a story that is real but irrelevant, yet creates a hint of suspicion by the simple fact that it has been reported. It is true and irrelevant that the magistrate wears turquoise socks, but the fact it has been reported creates a suggestion of something not quite confessed, leaving a mark, an impression. Nothing is more difficult to dispose of than an irrelevant but true story. The error made by La Repubblica in its campaign against Berlusconi was to give too much coverage to a relevant story, the party at Noemi's house. Point 3. If, instead, it had reported something like this, Berlusconi went into Piazza Navona yesterday morning, met his cousin, and they had a beer together. How curious, it would have triggered such a series of insinuations, suspicions, and embarrassments that the premier would have resigned long ago. In short, a fact that is too relevant can be challenged, whereas an accusation that is not an accusation cannot be challenged. At the age of 10 I was stopped in the doorway of a bar by a lady who said, "I'll give you 1 lira if you write a letter for me, I've hurt my hand." Being a decent child I replied that I didn't want any money and would do it simply as a favor, but the lady insisted on buying me an ice cream. I wrote the letter for her and explained what had happened when I got home. "Good Lord," said my mother, "they've made you write an anonymous letter. Heaven knows what will happen to us when they find out." "Look," I explained, "there's nothing terrible in that letter. In fact, it was addressed to a wealthy businessman, whom I also knew. He had a shop in the city center, and it said, 'It has come to our attention that you intend to ask for the hand of Signorina X in marriage. We wish to inform you that Signorina X is from a respectable and prosperous family and is highly regarded throughout the city.' Now, you don't usually see an anonymous letter that praises the subject of the letter rather than damning her. But what was the purpose of that anonymous letter? Since the lady who recruited me clearly had no grounds for saying anything else, she wanted at least to create unease. The recipient would have wondered, why should they send me such a letter? What does highly regarded throughout the city actually mean? I believe the wealthy businessman would have decided in the end to postpone the idea of marriage for fear of setting up home with someone so gossiped about. This form of noise doesn't even require that the transmitted messages be of any particular interest, since one message adds to another, and together they create noise. Noise can sometimes take the form of superfluous excess. A few months ago there was a fine article by Berselli in L'Espresso magazine, saying, "Do you realize that advertising no longer has any effect on us? No one can prove that one soap powder is better than another. In fact, they are all the same. So for the past 50 years the only method anyone has come up with shows us housewives who refuse the offer of 2 packets in exchange for their own brand, or grandmothers who tell us that this recalcitrant stain will disappear if we use the right powder. Soap companies therefore carry out an intensive and relentless campaign, consisting of the same message, which everyone knows by heart, so that it becomes proverbial. Omo washes whiter than white, and so on. Its purpose is twofold. Partly to repeat the brand name. In certain cases it becomes a successful strategy. If I have to go into a supermarket and ask for soap powder, I will ask for Tide or Omo because I have known these names for the past 50 years. And partly to prevent anyone from realizing that no epideictic discussion can be made about soap powder, either for or against. And the same happens with other forms of advertising. Berselli observes that in every mobile phone advert, none of us actually understand what the characters are saying. But there's no need to understand what they say. It is the great noise that sells cell phones. I think it is most probable that companies have jointly agreed to stop promoting their own particular brands and to carry out general publicity, to spread the mobile telephone culture. If you buy Nokia instead of Samsung, you will be persuaded by other factors, but not by advertising. In fact, the main function of the publicity noise is to remind you of the advertising sketch, not the product. Try to think of the most pleasant, the most enjoyable piece of advertising, some are even quite funny, and to remember which product it relates to. It is very rare that you manage to remember the name of the product to which that advertisement refers. The child who mispronounces Simmenthal, or perhaps, no martini, no party, or Ramazzotti is always good for you. In all other cases the noise compensates for the fact that there is no way to demonstrate the excellence of the product. The internet, of course, generates, with no intention to censor, the greatest noise that yields no information. Or rather, first, you receive information, but you don't know whether it is reliable. Second, you try searching for information on the internet. Only we academics and researchers, after 10 minutes work, can begin to select the information we want. Most other users are stuck on blogs, or on a porn site, and so forth, without surfing too far, because surfing isn't going to help them find reliable information. Looking further at cases of noise that do not presuppose any intention to censure, but nevertheless tend towards censorship, we should also mention the newspaper with 64 pages. 64 pages are too many to give real prominence to the most essential information. Here again, some of you will say, but I buy a newspaper to find the news that interests me. Certainly, but those who do that are an elite who know how to deal with information, and there must be some good explanation for the frightening drop in the number of newspapers being sold and read. Young people no longer read newspapers. It is easier to find the La Repubblica or Corriere della Sera sites on the internet. There, at least, it is all on one screen. Or to read the free sheets at the train station, where the news is set out on 2 pages. Therefore, as a result of noise, we have a deliberate censorship. This is what is happening in the world of television, in creating political scandals, and so forth. And we have an involuntary but fatal censorship whereby, for reasons that are entirely legitimate in themselves, such as advertising revenue, product sales, and so forth, and excessive information is transformed into noise. This, and here I am moving from communications to ethics, has also created a psychology and morality of noise. Look at that idiot walking along the street, wearing his iPod headphones. He cannot spend an hour on the train reading a newspaper or looking at the countryside, but has to go straight to his mobile phone during the first part of the journey to say, "I've just left," and on the second part of the journey to say, "I'm just arriving." There are people now who cannot live away from noise. And it is for this reason that restaurants, already noisy places, offer extra noise from a television screen, sometimes too, and music. And if you ask for them to be switched off, people stare at you as if you're mad. This great need for noise is like a drug. It is a way to avoid focusing on what is really important. Ready in interior em hominem. Yes, in the end, the example of St. Augustine could still provide a good ideal for the world of politics and television. It is in silence alone that the only truly powerful means of information becomes effective, word of mouth. All people, even when they are oppressed by the most censorious tyrants, have been able to find out all that is going on in the world through popular word of mouth. Publishers know that books do not become bestsellers through publicity or reviews but by what the French call bouche oreille and the Italians call passaparola. Books achieve success through word of mouth. In losing the condition of silence, we lose the possibility of hearing what other people are saying, which is the only basic and reliable means of communication. And that is why, in conclusion, I would say that one of the ethical problems we face today is how to return to silence. And one of the semiotic problems we might consider is the closer study of the function of silence in various aspects of communication, to examine a semiotics of silence. It may be a semiotics of reticence, a semiotics of silence in theater, a semiotics of silence in politics, a semiotics of silence in political debate. In other words, the long pause, silence is creation of suspense, silence is threat, silence is agreement, silence is denial, silence in music. Look how many subjects there are to study concerning the semiotics of silence. I invite you to consider, therefore, not words but silence. Lecture given during the conference of the Associazione Italiana di Semiotica, 2009. Imaginary Astronomies. I would like to make it clear straight away that in talking about imaginary geographies and astronomies I will not be dealing with astrology. The history of astrology has continually crossed paths with that of astronomy, but the imaginary astronomies and geographies I will be talking about have all now been recognized as entirely imaginary or false, whereas businessmen and heads of state still turn to astrologers for guidance. Therefore, astrology is not a science, whether exact or otherwise, but a religion, or a superstition, superstitions being other people's religions, and as such cannot be demonstrated as true or false. It is only a question of faith, and in questions of faith it is always better not to get involved, if only out of respect for those who believe. The imaginary geographies and astronomies I will be discussing were created by people of good faith who explored the sky and the earth as they saw them, and though they were wrong, we cannot doubt their good intentions. Yet those who are still involved in astrology today know perfectly well they are describing a sky that is different from that explored and defined by astronomy, and still they continue to behave as though their conception of the sky were true. There can be no sympathy for astrologers' bad faith. They are not people who are deceived, they are deceivers. End of argument. As a child I dreamed over atlases. I imagined journeys and adventures in exotic lands, where I thought of myself as a Persian conqueror traveling far into the steppes of Central Asia, then descending toward the seas of the Sonda to build an empire stretching from Ekbatana to the island of Sakhalin. This is perhaps why as an adult I decided to visit all those places whose names had caught my imagination, like Samarkand or Timbuktu, the Alamo or the River Amazon, and all I am missing now are Momprasim I and Casablanca. My astronomical exploits have been more difficult and always practiced vicariously. A friend of mine, a Czechoslovak exile who stayed at my house in the country during the 1970s and 80s, built telescopes and explored the sky at night from the terrace, calling me out when he found anything of interest. I came to the conclusion that only I and Rudolf II of Prague had had the privilege of lodging a Bohemian astronomer permanently under our roof, but then the Berlin Wall came down and my Bohemian astronomer returned to Bohemia. I have found consolation in my collection of antique books. I call it the Bibliotheca Semiologica Curiosa, Lunatica, Magica, et Pneumatica, and it consists entirely of books that describe falsities. It includes the works of Ptolemy but not those of Galileo, and though as a child I dreamed up my journeys over the classic modern-day atlas, I now prefer to do it over maps of Ptolemaic origin. Is this representation of the known world of that time an imaginary one? We need to distinguish between the various meanings of the word imaginary. Some astronomies have imagined a world based on pure speculation and mystical impulses. They tell us not what the visible cosmos looks like but what the invisible and spiritual forces are that pervade it. Other astronomies, though based on observation and experience, have nonetheless conceived explanations that we regard today as wrong. Look at the explanation that Athanasius Kircher gives for sunspots, in his Mundus Subterraneus of 1665, as being puffs of steam from the surface of the star. Ingenuous, but ingenious. And to remain with Kircher, this is how he applied the principles of physics and mathematical calculus in his Turris Babel of 1679, to show that it was impossible for the Tower of Babel to rise up to heaven. Beyond a certain height, having reached the same weight as the globe itself, the tower would have caused Earth's axis to rotate 45 degrees. The shape of the Earth. Anaximenes, in the 6th century BCE, spoke of a terrestrial rectangle made of earth and water, framed by the ocean, which sailed around on a sort of cushion of compressed air. It was fairly realistic for the ancients to believe the earth was flat. For Homer it was a disk surrounded by ocean and covered by the canopy of the heavens, and it was a flat disk for Thales and for Hecataeus of Miletus. It seemed less realistic to think it was spherical, as Pythagoras did, for mystical and mathematical reasons. The Pythagoreans had elaborated a complex planetary system in which the earth was not even at the center of the universe. The sun was also at the edge of it, and all the planetary spheres rotated around a central fire. Each rotating sphere, moreover, produced a sound from a range of musical notes, and to establish an exact correspondence between sounds and astronomical phenomena, a non-existent planet, the Antichthon, counter-Earth, was also introduced. In their mathematical and musical zeal, and in their scorn of sensory experience, the Pythagoreans had not considered that if each planet produced a sound from this range of notes, their planetary music would have produced a repugnant dissonance, as if a cat had suddenly jumped onto the keys of a piano. But we still find this idea more than 1,000 years later in Boethius, and let us not forget that Copernicus was also inspired by mathematical aesthetic principles. Subsequent demonstrations of the Earth's roundness, though, were based on empirical observations. Ptolemy, of course, knew that Earth was round, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to divide it into 360 degrees of longitude. But Parmenides, Eudoxus, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and Archimedes had already understood this. And Eratosthenes knew it in the 3rd century BCE, when he had calculated fairly accurately the length of Earth's meridian, calculating the different inclination of the sun, at midday on the summer solstice, when it reflected into the bottom of the wells of Alexandria and Syene, now Aswan. But, so far as the Earth being flat, I must digress for a moment to say that there is not only a history of imaginary astronomy, but also an imaginary history of astronomy, which still survives today in many scientific circles, not to mention in popular opinion. Try an experiment. Ask any reasonably intelligent person what Christopher Columbus wanted to demonstrate when he decided to reach the East by way of the West, and what the learned men of Salamanca persistently denied. The answer, in most cases, will be that Columbus thought the earth was round, while the learned men of Salamanca believed it was flat and that after a short distance the three caravels would fall off the edge into the cosmic abyss. 19th century secular thought, irritated by the fact that the Church had not accepted the heliocentric theory of the universe, attributed to Christian thought, both patristic and scholastic, the idea that the earth was flat. This idea gained force during the campaign by supporters of Darwin against all forms of fundamentalism. They wanted to show that since the Church was wrong about the Earth's being round, it could be wrong about the origin of species. They therefore took advantage of the fact that the 4th century Christian writer Lactantius, in his Divinae Institutiones, had contested the pagan theories about the roundness of the Earth by arguing that the Bible describes the universe on the model of the tabernacle. It must therefore be rectangular in form, not least because Lactantius could not accept the existence of the Antipodes, where people would have to walk around upside down. Then it was discovered that a 6th century Byzantine geographer, Cosmas Indicopleustes, in his Topographia Christiana, thinking once more of the biblical tabernacle, had claimed the cosmos was rectangular, with an arch over the flat floor of the earth. The curved vault remained hidden from our eyes by the stereoma, in other words, by the veil of the firmament. Beneath this was the ecumene, namely, all the land on which we live, which sits on the ocean and slopes imperceptibly and continually upward to the northwest. Here there is a mountain so high that it is lost to our view and its peak disappears among the clouds. The sun, moved by angels, who also control earthquakes and the rains and all other atmospheric phenomena, passes in the morning from the east toward the meridian, in front of the mountain, lighting up the world, and in the evening it reaches the west and disappears behind the mountain. The reverse cycle is followed by the moon and by the stars. Cosmos also shows us the earth as if we were looking at it from above. There is the frame of the ocean, beyond which are the lands where Noah lived before the flood. Farthest east from these lands, separated from the ocean by regions inhabited by monstrous beings, is the earthly paradise. The Euphrates, Tigris, and Ganges spring from paradise. They pass under the ocean and flow out into the Persian Gulf. The Nile takes a more tortuous route via the antediluvian lands, it enters the ocean, continues its course into the low northern regions, more accurately, into the land of Egypt, and flows out into the Golfo Romaco, the Hellespont. As Geoffrey Burton Russell has shown in his Inventing the Flat Earth, 1991, many influential books on the history of astronomy still studied at school claim that Cosmos's theory became the prevailing view throughout the Middle Ages. They also claim the medieval church taught that the earth was a flat disk, with Jerusalem at the center, and that the works of Ptolemy remained unknown throughout the Middle Ages. The fact is, Cosmos's text, written in Greek, a language the medieval Christian had forgotten, became known in the Western world only in 1706 and was published in English in 1897. No medieval writer knew of it. A first-year pupil at a secondary school can easily work out that if Dante enters the funnel of hell and leaves from the other side, seeing unknown stars from the slopes of Mount Purgatory, this means he knew perfectly well that the earth was round. But Origen, St. Ambrose, Albertus the Great, Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, and John of Holywood, to mention just a few, were all of the same view. The point of dispute at the time of Columbus was that the calculations made by the learned men of Salamanca were more accurate than his. They claimed that the earth, which was certainly round, was larger than our Genoese voyager imagined, and it was therefore pure folly to try to circumnavigate it. Columbus, however, a fine navigator but a useless astronomer, thought the earth was smaller than it was. Neither he nor the learned men of Salamanca, of course, suspected the existence of another continent between Europe and Asia. Though they were right, the doctors of Salamanca were wrong, and Columbus, though wrong, faithfully pursued his error and was right, through serendipity. How did the idea develop that in the Middle Ages people thought the earth was a flat disk? In the 7th century, Isidore of Seville, though hardly a model of scientific accuracy, calculated the equator to be 80,000 rods long. Therefore, he thought the earth was round. But among Isidore's manuscripts is a diagram that influenced many representations of our planet, the so-called TO map. The upper part represents Asia, at the top because, according to legend, earthly paradise was to be found in Asia. The horizontal bar represents the Black Sea on one side and the Nile on the other, and the vertical bar is the Mediterranean, so that the quarter circle on the left represents Europe and that on the right, Africa. All around it is the great circle of the ocean. The impression that the earth was seen as a circle is given by the maps illustrating the commentary on the Apocalypse by Beatus of Liébana. This text, written in the 8th century but illustrated by Mozarabic illuminators in later centuries, was to have a major influence on the art of the Romanesque abbeys and Gothic cathedrals, and its model is to be found in countless other illuminated manuscripts. How was it possible for people who thought the earth was round to draw maps showing it to be flat? The first explanation is that we do the same ourselves. Criticizing the flatness of these maps would be like criticizing the flatness of our modern-day atlas. It was a naive and conventional form of cartographic projection. It could be pointed out that over the same centuries the Arabs had produced more accurate maps, though they had the bad habit of representing north at the bottom and south at the top. But we have to bear in mind other considerations. The first is suggested by St. Augustine, who was well aware of the debate begun by Lactantius about the cosmos in the shape of a tabernacle, but was at the same time aware of the views of the ancients on the roundness of the globe. Augustine's conclusion is that we should not place too much emphasis on the biblical description of the tabernacle because, as we know, the Holy Scriptures often speak through metaphor, and perhaps the earth is round. But since knowledge about whether it is spherical or not doesn't help us to save our souls, we can ignore the question. This doesn't mean, as has often been suggested, that there was no medieval astronomy. We need only cite the story of Gerbert d'Aurillac, the 10th century Pope Sylvester II, who in order to obtain a copy of Lucan's Pharsalia promised an armillary sphere in exchange. Not realizing that the Pharsalia had been left incomplete on Lucan's death, upon receiving an incomplete manuscript he gave only half of the armillary sphere in exchange. This indicates the great attention given to classical culture during the early Middle Ages, but it also indicates the interest in astronomy at the time. Ptolemy Almagest and Aristotle's De Caelo were translated during the 12th and 13th centuries. As we all know, astronomy was one of the subjects of the quadrivium taught in medieval schools, and in the 8th century John of Holywood's Tractatus De Sphera Mundi, based on Ptolemy, was to be the undisputed authority for centuries to come. Yet it is also true that geographical and astronomical notions had long been confused by the ideas of authors such as Pliny or Solinus, for whom astronomy was certainly not of uppermost concern. The picture of the Ptolemaic cosmos, formed perhaps indirectly through other sources, was theological and most credible. Each element of the world, as Aristotle taught, had to remain in its proper natural place, from which it could be moved only by violence and not by nature. The natural place for the earthly element was the center of the world, whereas water and air had to remain in an intermediate position, and fire was at the edge. It was a reasonable and a reassuring picture, and this idea of the universe enabled Dante to imagine his journey into the three realms of the afterlife. And if this representation did not take account of all celestial phenomena, Ptolemy himself contrived to introduce adjustments and corrections, such as the theory of epicycles and deference, according to which, in order to explain various astronomical phenomena such as accelerations, positions, retrograde motions, and the variations in distances of various planets, it was supposed that each planet rotates around the Earth along a larger circle, called the deferent, but also moves in a small circle, or epicycle, around a point C of its own deferent. Lastly, the Middle Ages was a period of great travel, but with the roads in disrepair, great forests to pass through, and stretches of sea to be crossed at the mercy of buccaneers, there was no possibility of drawing adequate maps. They were purely indicative, like the instructions in the Pilgrim's Guide at Santiago de Compostela, which said, more or less, if you want to get from Rome to Jerusalem, head southward and ask along the way. Now, try thinking of the rail maps you find with train timetables. No one could deduce the exact shape of Italy from that series of junctions, each perfectly clear in itself when you have to take a train from Milan to Livorno, and realize that you have to change at Genoa. The exact shape of Italy is of no interest to anyone traveling to that station. The Romans built a series of roads that linked every city in the known world, but this is how those roads were represented in the map known as the Tabula Peutingeriana, named after the man who had rediscovered it in the 15th century. The upper part represents Europe, with Africa below, but we are in exactly the same situation as the railway map. From this map we can see the roads, our points of departure and arrival, but have absolutely no idea about the shape of Europe, or the Mediterranean, or Africa, and the Romans certainly had a much clearer notion of geography than this. They were not interested in the shape of the continents, but rather in weather. For example, there was a road that would take them from Marseille to Genoa. Then again, medieval journeys were imaginary. The Middle Ages produced encyclopedias, Imagines Mundi, whose authors tried as far as possible to satisfy the taste for wonder, writing about far-off, inaccessible lands, and these books are all written by people who had never seen the places they are describing. The force of tradition at that time was more important than experience. A map did not seek to represent the form of the earth but to list cities and peoples along the way. Once again, symbolic representation was more important than empirical representation. In many maps, the illuminator was most concerned about placing Jerusalem at the center of the earth, rather than showing how to get there. Yet most maps of that period represent Italy and the Mediterranean fairly accurately. One last consideration. Medieval maps did not have a scientific purpose but instead responded to the audience's need for wonder, in rather the same way that popular magazines today show us that flying saucers exist and we are told on television that the pyramids were built by an extraterrestrial civilization. The creators of these maps looked up at the sky with the naked eye to see comets, which the imagination immediately transformed into something that, today, would confirm the existence of UFOs. On many 15th and 16th century maps with a reasonably accurate cartographic layout, mysterious monsters are depicted in the lands where they are supposed to live, and are reproduced on the map in a not entirely mythical fashion. So let us not be too critical of medieval maps. It is with them that Marco Polo arrived in China, the Crusaders in Jerusalem, and perhaps the Irish or the Vikings in America. A short aside, is it really true, as legend suggests, that the Vikings reached America? We all know that the real revolution in medieval navigation came with the invention of the stern-mounted hinged rudder. On Greek and Roman ships, as well as those of the Vikings and even those of William the Conqueror who landed on the English coast in 1066, the rudder consisted of two rear-side oars, operated in such a way as to set the intended direction of the boat. The system, apart from being fairly exhausting to use, made it practically impossible to maneuver large wooden vessels. Above all, it was impossible to sail against the wind. To do so, it was necessary to tack, to move the rudder so that each side of the boat faced alternately into the wind, first one side and then the other. Sailors therefore had to limit themselves to navigating close to shore, following the coastlines so that they could take shelter when the wind was unfavorable. The Vikings, and the same was true for the Irish monks, could never, therefore, have sailed from Spain to Central America, as Columbus would later do. But the picture changes if we imagine they first took a route from Iceland to Greenland, and from there to the Canadian coast. Looking at a map, we can easily see how skilled mariners in longships could succeed, with who knows how many shipwrecks along the way, in reaching the far north of the American continent and perhaps the coast of Labrador. The shape of the sky. But let us leave the earth and look at the sky. Aristarchus of Samos had advanced a heliocentric theory between the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, as Copernicus recorded. Plutarch tells us that Aristarchus was accused of impiety precisely because he had put the earth in movement so as to explain, through earthly rotation, astronomical phenomena that could not otherwise be accounted for. Plutarch did not agree with this theory and Ptolemy later judged it ridiculous. Aristarchus was way ahead of his time, and perhaps he reached his conclusion for the wrong reasons. There again, the history of astronomy is curious. A great materialist such as Epicurus developed an idea that survived for so long that it was still being discussed by Gassendi in the 17th century, as well as appearing in Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. He suggested that the sun, the moon, and the stars, for many very serious reasons, can be neither larger nor smaller than how they appear to our senses. So Epicurus judged the sun to have a diameter of about 30 centimeters. Copernicus's De Revolutione Bus Orbium Coelestium was published in 1543. We imagine the world was suddenly turned upside down and we talk about the Copernican revolution. But Galileo's Dialogo sopra I due Massimi Systemi was published in 1632, 89 years later, and we know what opposition this met. There again, the astronomies of both Copernicus and Galileo were imaginary, since they were wrong about the nature of planetary orbits. But the most rigorous of imaginary astronomies was that of Tycho Brahe, a great astronomer and Kepler's teacher, who admitted that planets rotate round the sun. Otherwise many astronomical phenomena could not be explained, but claimed that the sun and planets rotate round the earth, which remains immobile at the center of the universe. Brahe's theory was taken seriously, for example, by the Jesuits and especially by Athanasius Kircher. Kircher was a cultured man and could no longer accept the Ptolemaic system. In an illustration of solar systems in his Iter Ecstaticum Coeleste, 1660 edition, alongside the Platonic system and the Egyptian system he shows us the Copernican system, explaining it accurately, but adding this note: Quem dane secuti sunt pain omnes mathematici a Catholici et non nulli ex Catholicus, quibus nimirum ingenium et calamus prurit ad nova venditanda. This was later accepted by almost all non-Catholic and some Catholic mathematicians, namely those who evidently had a craving to peddle new ideas in their writings. Not being of that accursed breed, Kircher thus prefers Brahe. There were, however, very strong arguments against the idea of an earth that moves around the sun. In his Utrus Cosma Historia of 1617, Robert Flood uses mechanical arguments to show that if you have to turn a wheel, like that of the celestial wheel, it is easier to make it turn by exercising a force around the circumference, the point among the spheres where the prime immobile was, than by acting on the center, where the foolish Copernicans would place the sun and every generating force of life and motion. Alessandro Dissoni, in his Dici Libri di Pensieri Diversi of 1627, lists a range of reasons why the movement of the earth seemed inconceivable. I will quote two of them. Argument of the eclipse. By removing the earth from the center of the universe, it has to be placed either below or above the moon. If we place it below, there will never be an eclipse of the sun since the moon, being above the sun and above the earth, will never come between the earth and the sun. If we place it above, there will never be an eclipse of the moon, since the earth will never be able to come between it and the sun. And what is more, astronomy could no longer predict eclipses, since it bases its calculations on the movements of the sun, and if the sun does not move, such calculations would be in vain. Argument of the birds. If the earth moves, birds flying westward would never be able to keep up with its rotation and would never go forward. Descartes, who favored Galileo's hypothesis but never had the courage to publish his opinions about it, had developed quite an interesting theory involving vortexes, or tourbillons, in Principia Philosophiae, 1644. He imagined that the heavens were liquid matter, like a sea, swirling about, forming eddies or whirlpools. These vortexes carry planets with them, and the earth is carried in a vortex around the sun. But it is the vortex that moves. The earth remains immobile in the vortex that carries it. Descartes was shrewd in setting out these astonishing explanations, a way of getting out of the impasse between the geocentric and heliocentric arguments, as a mere hypothesis, without having to dispute the truth recognized by the Church. As Apollinaire said, Pitié, pitié pour nous qui combattons aux frontières de la limite et de l'avenir, pitié pour nos péchés, pitié pour nos erreurs. These were times when the astronomer could still commit many serious mistakes, as happened to Galileo when, through his telescope, he discovered the rings of Saturn but could not work out what they were. First of all, he declares he has seen not one single star but three joined together in a straight line parallel to the equinoctial, and represents what he has seen as three small circles. In his later writing he suggests that Saturn may appear in the shape of an olive, and finally he no longer describes three bodies or an olive, but two semi-ellipses with two very dark little triangles in the middle of the said figures, and draws Saturn to look very much like Mickey Mouse. Only later would Huygens describe a ring, an infinity of worlds. Roaming among worlds constructed by the imagination, the imaginary astronomy of our forebears, shaded with hints of the occult, was able to create a revolutionary idea, that of the plurality of worlds. It was an idea already present among the ancient atomists, in Democritus, Leucippus, Epicurus, and Lucretius. As Hippolytus tells us in his Philosophomena, if atoms are in continuous movement in the void, they cannot but produce infinite worlds, each different from the other. And some have neither sun nor moon, for others the stars appear larger than they do for us, and from others many more stars are seen. For Epicurus, it was a hypothesis that, since it could not be contradicted, had to be taken as true until shown to be false. In the words of Lucretius, De Rerum Natura, Book 2, lines 1050-51, nulla est finis. Uti docui, res ipsac per se, vociferator, et elucid natura profundi. There is no limit. I have shown this, the facts speak for themselves, and the nature of the void is evident. And he continues, thus it is increasingly necessary you recognize that other congregations of material bodies exist elsewhere in the universe, like this of our world, which the ether encircles in eager embrace. Lines 1064-66. Both the void and the plurality of worlds were disputed by Aristotle and, as well as Aristotle, by great scholars such as Thomas Aquinas and Roger Bacon. But when it came to the debate over the infinita potentia Dei, suspicions about the plurality of worlds would be expressed by William of Ockham, Buridan, Nicole Oresme, and others. Nicholas of Cusa spoke about an infinity of worlds in the 15th century and Giordano Bruno in the 16th century. The deadly poison contained in this hypothesis would emerge more clearly when it gained support from the new Epicureans, the 17th century freethinkers. The idea of visiting other worlds, of finding other inhabitants there, was a far more dangerous heresy than the notion of heliocentricity. The infinity of worlds casts doubt on the uniqueness of redemption. Adam's sin and Christ's passion are either just minor episodes relevant to our world but not to other divine creatures, or else Golgotha would have to be repeated an infinite number of times on endless planets, removing the sublime uniqueness of the sacrifice of the Son of Man. As Fontenelle would recall in his Intritions sur la pluralité des mondes, 1686, the suggestion was already there in the Cartesian theory of vortexes, because if every star sweeps its planets into a vortex, and the star is swept away by a larger vortex, it was possible to imagine in the sky an infinity of vortexes carrying an infinity of planetary systems. The idea of the plurality of worlds heralded the beginning of modern science fiction in the 17th century, from the travels of Cyrano de Bergerac in The Empires of the Sun and of the Moon, to Francis Godwin's The Man in the Moon and John Wilkins's discovery of a world in the moon. As to methods for takeoff, we have not yet reached Jules Verne. Cyrano, the first time, attaches to his body a great number of ampoules filled with dewdrops, and the heat of the sun, attracting the dewdrops, makes him rise. On a second occasion he uses a machine driven by firecrackers. Godwin, however, proposes an airplane antilitterum propelled by birds. Science fiction. Modern science fiction, from Verne to the 21st century, opens up another chapter of imaginary astronomies, in which theories of astronomy and scientific cosmology are taken to the extreme. My old pupil Renato Giovanoli has written a fascinating book on science and science fiction, too, in which he examines not only all the, often highly convincing, pseudoscientific theories developed in stories about the future, but also shows how science in science fiction consists of a fairly uniform body of ideas and topoi that return from narrator to narrator, with subsequent improvements and developments. These include Verne's cannons loaded with nitroglycerin and Wells's anti-gravitational rooms, time travel and the various techniques for space navigation, traveling while in a state of hibernation. The spaceship is a small, ecologically self-sufficient world, with hydroponic gardening systems, and the infinite variations on the Langevin paradox, whereby the astronaut returns from a voyage in space at the speed of light, only to find himself 10 years younger than his twin brother. Robert A. Heinlein, for example, in Time for the Stars, wrote a story involving twins who communicate telepathically during the journey, but Tullio Reggi, in his Cronache dell'Universo, noted that if telepathic messages arrive instantly, the answer from the brother in space ought to arrive before the question. Another recurring theme is that of hyperspace, which Heinlein, in Starman Jones, describes using a scarf as a model. Here's Mars. Here's Jupiter. To go from Mars to Jupiter you have to go from here to here. But suppose I fold the scarf so that Mars is on top of Jupiter? What's to prevent us just stepping across? So science fiction has been off in search of abnormal parts of the universe where space can fold back on itself. It has also used scientific hypotheses, such as Einstein-Rosen bridges, black holes, and spacetime wormholes. Kurt Vonnegut, in The Sirens of Titan, theorized about chronosynclastic infundibula, tunnels in hyperspace, while others have invented tachyons, particles that move faster than light. 3 All the problems of time travel have been discussed, with and without the time traveler meeting his own double, including the famous grandfather paradox, whereby if we go back in time and kill our grandfather before he gets married, perhaps we would disappear at that moment, using also the concepts developed by scientists, such as Hans Reichenbach in The Direction of Time, in relation to closed causal chains whereby, at least in the subatomic world, A causes B, B causes C, and C causes A. Philip K. Dick, in Counterclock World, theorized about entropic inversion. The first part of Frederick Brown's short story, The End, makes the supposition that time is a field and that the character Professor Jones has found a machine that reverses it. Jones presses the button, and the second part consists of the same words as the first, but in reverse order. And finally, using the ancient theory of the infinity of worlds, writers have imagined parallel universes, so that Frederick Brown, in his novel What Mad Universe, reminds us that an infinite number of universes can exist at the same time. There is, for example, a universe in which this exact scene is being repeated, except that you, or the equivalent of you, are wearing brown shoes instead of black ones. There are an infinite number of permutations on that variation, such as one in which you have a slight scratch on your left forefinger, and one in which you have purple horns. But on the logic of possible worlds, philosophers such as D.K. Lewis, in Counterfactuals, 1973, has also stated, I emphatically do not identify possible worlds in any way with respectable linguistic entities. I take them to be respectable entities in their own right. When I profess realism about possible worlds, I mean to be taken literally. Our actual world is only one world among others. You believe in our actual world already. I ask you to believe in more things of that kind. How much separates science fiction from the science that preceded it or will come after it? Given that science fiction writers certainly read the work of scientists, how many scientists have nourished their imaginations reading science fiction? How many imaginary astronomies of science fiction are, or will remain, imaginary? I have found a text by Thomas Aquinas, in Primum Sententiarum, Distinction 8, Article 1.2, in which he distinguishes two types of morphological relationship between cause and effect. Cause can resemble effect, as a person resembles his portrait, or cause can be different from effect, as happens with fire that causes smoke, and in this second category of causes Aquinas includes the sun, which produces heat but is itself cold. We may laugh, since he reached this model from his theory of celestial spheres, but if one day cold fusion is taken seriously, might we have to reconsider this idea of Aquinas with more respect? The cold sun and the hollow earth. Speaking of the cold sun, certain kinds of geoastronomy have gone beyond the bounds of imagination into the realms of insanity, and yet seem to have influenced some very serious, though scarcely laudable, ideas and decisions. In 1925, the theory of an Austrian pseudoscientist, Hans Horbiger, which was called the WEL, the Weltteilung or world ice theory, began to circulate within Nazi circles. 4. This theory was to enjoy the support of men like Rosenberg and Himmler. But when Hitler rose to power, Horbiger was taken seriously even by some members of the scientific community, including people like Leonard, who had discovered X-rays with Röntgen. According to Horbiger, the cosmos was the theater of an eternal struggle between ice and fire, which produces not an evolution but an alternation of cycles or epochs. An enormous hot body, millions of times larger than the sun, had once collided with an immense accumulation of cosmic ice. The mass of ice had penetrated into this incandescent body and, after having worked within it as a vapor for hundreds of millions of years, had made the whole thing explode. Various fragments were propelled into frozen space as well as into an intermediate zone, where they established the solar system. The Moon, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn are blocks of ice, and the Milky Way is a circle of ice. Traditional astronomy purports that the Milky Way is made up of stars, but trick photography creates this illusion. Sunspots are produced by blocks of ice that break off from Jupiter. The power of the original explosion is now diminishing and each planet does not revolve elliptically, as official science erroneously believes, but is, imperceptibly, spiraling toward the planet that most attracts it. At the end of the cycle in which we are living, the Moon will move closer and closer to Earth, gradually raising the level of the oceans, submerging the tropics, and leaving only the highest mountains above water. The cosmic rays will become more powerful and will produce genetic mutations. In the end, our own satellite will explode and be transformed into a ring of ice, water, and gas, which will then precipitate onto Earth. As the result of a complex series of events caused by the influence of Mars, Earth will also become a globe of ice and in the end will be reabsorbed by the Sun. There will then be a new explosion and a new beginning. In the same way, the Earth in the past has already had, and then reabsorbed, 3 other satellites. This cosmogony obviously presupposed a sort of eternal return, which harked back to ancient myths and epics. What Nazis today call knowledge of tradition was once again contrasted with the false knowledge of liberal and Jewish science. A glacial cosmogony, moreover, seemed very Nordic and Aryan. Pauwels and Bergier, in their Le Matin des Magiciens, 5 attribute this great belief in the frozen origins of the cosmos to the faith, encouraged by Hitler, that their troops would cope very well in frozen Russia. But the authors also suggest that the need to test how cosmic ice would react had also delayed experiments on the V-1 flying bombs. Someone writing under the name of Elmar Brugge Six published a book in 1938 in which he paid tribute to Horbiger as the 20th century Copernicus, claiming that the world ice theory explained the profound links between earthly events and cosmic forces and concluding that the silence on the part of democratic Jewish science to Horbiger's ideas was a typical case of the conspiracy of mediocrity. The fact that the Nazi Party was surrounded by followers of magical, hermetic, and neo-templaristic practices, such as the disciples of the Thule Gesellschaft founded by Rudolf von Sebetendorf, has already been amply studied. 7. Another theory was taken seriously in Nazi circles. that the Earth is hollow and that we do not live outside, on the convex external crust, but inside, on the concave internal surface. This theory was first proposed in the early 19th century by a certain Captain John Cleves Sims of Ohio, who wrote to various scientific societies, to all the world. I declare that the Earth is hollow and habitable within, containing a number of solid concentric spheres, one within the other, and that it is open at the poles 12 or 16 degrees. The wooden model of his universe can be seen today at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. The theory was taken up again 50 years later by Cyrus Reed Teed, who declared that what we believe to be the sky is a mass of gas that fills the interior of the globe with areas of brilliant light. The sun, the moon, and the stars were not, he said, celestial globes but visual effects caused by various phenomena. After the First World War, the theory was introduced into Germany by Peter Bender, and then by Karl Neupert, who founded the movement based on the Hohlwedler, the hollow earth theory. According to some sources, the theory was taken seriously among members of the German hierarchy, and in certain parts of the German Navy it was believed that the hollow earth theory made it possible to fix the positions of English ships more accurately because, if infrared rays were used, the curvature of the Earth would not have obscured observation. It is even said that some of the V1 firings were wrong because the trajectory was calculated on the basis of a concave and not a convex land surface. If this is true, then the historical and providential utility of insane astronomies is perfectly apparent. Imaginary geography and true history. During the second half of the 12th century, a letter reached the West telling how in the Far East, beyond the regions occupied by the Muslims, beyond those lands that the Crusaders had tried to take from the dominion of the infidels but had nonetheless returned to their dominion, there flourished a Christian kingdom, governed by the legendary Prester John, or Presbyter Johannes, re potentia et virtute Dei et Domini Nostri Iesu Christi. The letter began as follows. Hear and believe. I, Presbyter Johannes, the Lord of Lords, surpass all under heaven in virtue, in riches, and in power. 72 kings pay us tribute. In the three Indies our magnificence rules, and our lands extend beyond India, where rests the body of the holy apostle Thomas. They reach toward the sunrise over the wastes, and extend toward deserted Babylon near the Tower of Babel. In our domains live elephants, dromedaries, camels, hippopotami, crocodiles, metagallinari, cametenus, tincerete, panthers, onagers, red and white lions, white bears and blackbirds, mute cicadas, griffins, tigers, jackals, hyenas, wild oxen, centaurs, wild men, horned men, fawns, satyrs and women of the same species, pygmies, men with dogs' heads, giants 40 cubits tall, monocles, cyclops, a bird called phoenix, and almost every kind of animal that lives beneath the vault of the heavens. In one of our provinces the river known as Indus flows. This river, whose source is in paradise, winds its way along various branches through the entire province, and in it are found natural stones, emeralds, sapphires, garnets, topaz, chrysolite, onyx, beryl, amethyst, sardonyx, and many other precious stones. And so it went on, listing other wonders. Translated and paraphrased many times during the following centuries, up to the 17th century, and in various languages and versions, the letter was to be highly influential in the expansion of the Christian West toward the East. The idea that a Christian kingdom might exist beyond the Muslim lands justified all enterprises in expansion and exploration. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, William of Rubruck, and Marco Polo all mentioned Prester John. Toward the middle of the 14th century, Prester John's kingdom moved from a vague orient toward Ethiopia when Portuguese mariners began their African campaign. Attempts to contact him were made in the 15th century by Henry IV of England, by the Duc de Berry, and by Pope Eugene IV. In Bologna, at the time of the coronation of Emperor Charles V, there were still discussions about Prester John as a possible ally for the recapture of the Holy Sepulchre. How did Prester John's letter come into being, and what was its purpose? Perhaps it was a piece of anti-Byzantine propaganda, produced in the scriptoria of Frederick I, but the problem is not so much its origin as the way it was received. Through geographical fantasy a political project gradually gained strength. In other words, the specter evoked by some scribe inclined to forgery, a highly respectable literary genre at the time, was used as an excuse for expanding the Christian world toward Africa and Asia, a friendly gesture in supporting the white man's burden. And thus we have a case of imaginary geography that has produced real history. And it is not the only case. I would like to finish with the 16th century Typus Orbis Terrarum by Ortelius. Ortelius had already portrayed the American continent with remarkable precision, but he still thought, like many before and after, that Terra Australis, an immense cap covering the southern part of the planet, existed. It was in search of this hypothetical austral land that indefatigable mariners like Mendaña, Bougainville, Tasman, and Cook explored the Pacific. Thanks to an imaginary map, the real Australia, Tasmania, and New Zealand were eventually discovered. Spare a thought, then, for those who fought at the frontiers of infinity and the future. Remember the greatness of those imaginary geographies and astronomies, and those errors that often bore fruit. Revised version of 2 lectures, one given in 2001 at a conference of astronomers and the other in 2002 at a conference of geographers. Living by Proverbs. No copy in the NUC. And not only that, not mentioned in Burnett or Grace. Not to be found, despite its subject, in the bibliographies on occultism, Caille, Ferguson, Duveen, Virginelli Rota, Bibliotheca Magica, Rosenthal, Dorban, Guaita, and so on, so that it is difficult to obtain information about this anonymous pamphlet, which, apart from bearing no date, was published in one of the usual phantom cities, Philadelphia, printed by Secundus Moore, with a very appealing title, On the New Utopia, or De Insula Perdita, wherein a most ingenious legislator had created the Republique of Happiness following the principle by which proverbs are the wisdom of mankind. 8 Vo 233, 45, 6, 1 White. The book is divided into two parts. The first sets out the basic principles on which the Republic of Happiness was founded. The second lists its disadvantages and the misfortunes that followed the constitution of that state, and the reasons why this utopia failed after only a few years. The fundamental utopian principle from which the legislator started was that proverbs are not only the wisdom of humanity, but that the voice of the people is the voice of God. The perfect state must therefore be based on this single wisdom. All other moral, social, political, or religious ideologies and designs having previously failed because intellectual hubris had distanced them from ancient wisdom. Learn from the past, believe in the future, and live for the present. A few months after this Republic of Happiness had been established, it was quickly realized how the utopian principle complicated daily life. Difficulties arose at once when it came to hunting and obtaining basic supplies, since people followed the principle that those with no dog must hunt with a cat, with poor results. They had originally restricted themselves to fishing, but the fishermen used to take excessive quantities of stimulants, convinced that those who sleep don't catch any fish, so that they were worn out in body and spirit and ended their careers at an early age. Agriculture was in continual crisis, since it was said that when the pear is ripe it falls by itself. It was impossible to make or sell cooking pans due to a deep-rooted mistrust of coppersmiths, given, as we know, that it's the devil who makes the pots. So the coppersmiths tried to make and sell just the lids, for which there was a complete lack of demand since no one was buying any pans. Traveling by road was difficult. Assuming that he who leaves the old road for the new knows what he's left but not what he'll find, U-turns were prohibited, there's no going back to where you began. As well as junctions, he who follows every path will discover many dangers. In any event, all vehicles were banned, slow and steady wins the race. And people were generally discouraged not only from traveling but also from industry, since he who dreams much needs little, which also encouraged the use of drugs. Even the postal services were abolished, since those who want something serve themselves, those who don't send someone else. It was difficult to protect property. A dog that barks doesn't bite, so they were muzzled to stop them from barking, and the muzzles were so restrictive that burglars could come and go as they pleased. A misinterpreted principle of cooperation had established that for a well-dressed salad you want a miser for the vinegar, a wise man for the salt, and a spendthrift for the oil. It was well known that oil, vinegar, salt, and pepper make even an old boo taste better, so that every time they wanted to do any cooking, since it is easy to play with fire using someone else's hand, they had to work with someone they considered suitable, or whoever applied for the job. It wasn't difficult to find a spendthrift to make the dressing. A born idiot is the source of perpetual amusement, but it was difficult finding a miser, since no one wished to be described as such, and, what is more, a miser is also stingy with his own time, and a miser, like a pig, is excellent after he's dead. In the end, they usually gave up dressing salad since, after all, hunger is the best sauce. Social life was reduced to the exchange of a few monosyllables. Given that silence is golden, it often speaks louder than words. One word is enough to the wise. A closed mouth catches no flies. Give every man your ear but few your voice, and man is weakened by the words he speaks and strengthened by those he doesn't. Better safe than sorry. What is more, it was well known that when the wine is poured, the wit is gone. That wine brings out joy but also secrets. That drink and bad luck follow the same path. So that convivial gatherings were therefore avoided, and on the rare occasions they took place, they ended in furious violence, since he who strikes first strikes twice. Gambling was also impossible, as a result of a misunderstood principle of cooperation, since he who trusts in chance takes a blind man as his guide, and it was difficult to find a blind man for every player, and then it was enough for someone with one eye to arrive for the game to end in his favor, since in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Games involving skill, such as archery, were forbidden since, sooner or later, the arrow strikes back at he who shoots it. It was difficult to run any kind of shop. Difficult for confectionaires, since you get what you deserve, and they were continual victims of their customers' custard pie humor. Negotiations degenerated into unpleasant arguments since, it being true that it's the rudest one who does the buying, when a customer entered the shop asking how such rubbish could possibly be on sale, the angry shopkeeper would reply, "You're the rubbish, and that whore your mother," thus provoking what has been called the Zidane syndrome. Finally, as we know, there's always a time to pay and a time to die, and shopkeepers were being ruined by their customers' habitual failure to honor their debts. In any event, little work was done, because for every saint a feast, so that there were 365 feast days a year. Though when the feast is over, the saint's forgotten, with continual celebration, and at table you grow young, and of course, on St. Martin's Day the must turns to wine. Due to this excessive veneration of the saints, at carnival time, when anything goes, joking was limited to the confines of the barracks, bringing disorder among the entire army. Indeed, starting off from the conviction that I can protect myself from my enemies, but may God protect me from my friends, the armed forces were then disbanded. Religious life was fraught with difficulties. First of all, it was difficult to recognize priests because clothes don't make the man, and these clerics were always traveling around in disguise. Secondly, bearing in mind that God speaks to those who stay silent, prayer was discouraged. The administration of justice was a real headache. A criminal conviction was almost unheard of, since confession is halfway to forgiveness, and in any event it could not be made public, since as they say, judge the sin but not the sinner. It was far too expensive to go to lawyers since good advice is beyond all price, and judges were reluctant to call witnesses to trial, claiming that the more you listen the less you understand, and the few to be summoned were terminally ill, as it was thought that those leaving hospital or the graveyard are always more sincere. Crimes committed against other members of the family could not be punished. Everyone is king in their own home, and industrial injuries could not be investigated as it was taken for granted that the higher you climb the farther you fall, suddenly and at great speed. There was plea bargaining for the more serious crimes, and convicts could avoid the death penalty by having their tongue cut out. A still tongue makes a wise head, and a raw deal is better than none at all. Sometimes there were beheadings followed by barbarous attempts to organize races between those executed. Those who lose their heads have strong legs, with results that were obviously disappointing. What is more, it was very hard to convict robbers, who, believing that courtesy is the key that opens every door, rather than arriving armed, managed to take money and possessions through simple persuasion and then use the defense that the victims had willingly handed over their property. Generally speaking, however, there was a reluctance to inflict any penalty, since those who fear not the sermon heed not the punishment. At a certain point it was recognized that he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, and the law of retaliation was established and carried out in public. This method brought effective results for crimes such as murder but caused some embarrassing situations in the carrying out of public punishments for the offense of sodomy, and the practice was soon abandoned. Desertion was not a crime, since he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day, though strangely enough it was a crime to use invisible ink, given that only fools can read their own writing. Pictures of the dead could no longer be shown on tombs, since all those you think are dead keep cropping up when you least expect them, therefore those who really are dead are better not seen at all. Finally, the judges enjoyed the worst possible reputation by reason of the so-called first principle of the bandana. The wrongdoer always blames his accuser. According to the second principle, the petty thief ends up in prison while the big-time crook ends up in power. In a republic based on such blatant injustice, the position of women was tragic. Popular wisdom had never treated them kindly, establishing that when it comes to fire, women, and sea, there is little to joke about. Keep your wife well away from your priest, your best friend, and your brother-in-law. A crying woman and a sweating horse are more false than Judas. Woman is a fickle thing. There's no point in locking your doors when women fall in love. Women know more than the devil. A woman is first sweet as honey, then bitter as gall. There's no peace in the chicken coop when the hen crows and the rooster stays silent. Woman is woe. Every single day, wives were condemned to hear complaints about their husband's mother, since it was thought that the best way to get through to the mother-in-law is through her daughter-in-law. When they had the misfortune to marry a loving husband, they would be subjected to continual ill treatment, since those who love hard, fight hard. All is fair in love and war. And spinsters couldn't even hope to find an older, less fiery husband, since men after the age of 59 leave the women and take to wine. This basic misogyny made sexual relationships generally difficult. Indeed, it was known that wine, women, and tobacco are the undoing of all men. Better alone than in bad company, and there was a general mistrust of amorous behavior, since warm caresses are the sure sign of a guilty conscience. Conversely, adultery was commonly practiced. Best make love with the woman next door. You'll save on travel and see her more. As the new year brings new life, it was thought that children should all be born in January and therefore conceived in early April. But since Christmas is for family and Easter for friends, all conceptions were adulterous, so that the Republic of Happiness consisted almost entirely of illegitimate children. These sexual difficulties were not even compensated by onanistic practices or the sale of pornography, since, though it is true that a contented mind is a perpetual feast, to look and not to touch is one hell of a task. Cases of homosexuality were not infrequent, since it was thought that birds of a feather flock together. Why not? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Nor was it felt that many problems could be resolved by doctors, in relation to whom there was the greatest distrust. It was thought, above all, that anxiety was worse than the ailment, that no doctor can cure fear, that doctors' mistakes end up in the graveyard, that the dentist gets fat with other people's teeth, and finally, that not all that's bad is harmful, and where there's life there's hope. At worst they resorted to euthanasia, since desperate ills require drastic remedies. An apple a day keeps the doctor away, and shaving makes you feel good for a day, a wife makes you feel good for a month, and a pig makes you feel good for a year. So people used to kill a pig rather than go to the doctor. The heart cannot be commanded, so there wasn't much work for cardiologists. Ear, nose, and throat specialists were notorious for cutting off the nose to spite the face, and veterinary surgeons did not enjoy a particularly fine reputation as they were always looking a gift horse in the mouth and would treat only the most expensive stallions. Doctors preferred to avoid visiting the hospitals, thinking that those who walk with the lame men end up limping. The last consolation for these unfortunate people would have been games and entertainments. But any sports competition was always decided before it began. When you have them by the balls, their hearts and minds will follow. Since a good horseman is never without his lance, horse racing was practically impossible, given the way that the lance impeded the jockey. Traditional mud wrestling was hardly worth it, since when you fight with mud, win or lose, the mud will continue to stick. The only game that was actually played involved a sort of tall greasy fairground pole, at the top of which a chicken bone was placed. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. But do not imagine that citizens, due to the lack of sporting and sexual activity, would take solace in education. First of all, they were mistrustful of schooling, since experience is more important than learning, and they were mistrustful of logic, since ifs and buts don't make history. The teachers were terrible, since those who can, do, and those who can't, teach, nor were the pupils aware of it. He who asks the question makes no mistakes. The study of mathematics was reduced to a minimum, since children got only as far as learning that two's company but three's a crowd. Advanced math was worse still, since there was a taboo against squaring the circle. Those who are born round cannot die square. The brighter students were at a disadvantage. Those who speak first know least, and quickly fell ill. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. So they decided it is better to be a live ass than a dead doctor. Once they had completed their studies, students could not present a curriculum vitae when applying for a job, fearing that pride comes before a fall. This tended to lead to unemployment or underemployment. Learn an art and keep it apart. There again, he who at 20 doesn't have it, at 30 doesn't do it, and by 40 has lost what little he had. Technological skills were minimal. Recycling systems were forbidden. Water that has passed the mill can no longer turn the wheel. And only very slow traditional methods were followed. The seas fill up drop by drop, while the horse lives the grass grows, and haste makes waste. In short, it is clear that the people of the Republic of Happiness were most unhappy, so that they gradually abandoned the island and its legislator, who had to recognize that his utopia had failed. Better late than never. As the anonymous author of this pamphlet wisely states, in criticizing the excessive trust in Proverbs, old wisdom does not nourish the hungry man. Between saying and doing many a pair of shoes is worn out, and you can have too much of a good thing. The legislator thought that one thing would lead to another, but we recognize the tree by its fruit, and sooner or later the comb finds all the knots. If all's well that ends well, and slow and steady wins the race, conversely, all that's bad ends badly, and he who makes his bed must lie on it, since he who is born miserable dies disconsolate, and he who sows when the wind blows, harvests only confusion. All good things come to an end. It would have been better to know from the very start that there's woodworm in every plank and two sides to every coin. But there's no point crying over spilled milk, and so long as you have your own teeth, there's no telling what the future holds. And this is also true for our anonymous author of long ago. Let the dead bury the dead. And I have described only what I have read, so don't shoot the messenger. A spurious review that appeared in Almanacco del Bibliofilo, Viaggi nel Tempo. Alla ricerca di nuovo Isole dell'Utopia, edited by Mario Scognamiglio, Milan. Rovello, 2007. I am Edmond Dantes. Some unfortunates have been initiated into literature reading someone like, say, Rob Grillet. You can read Rob Grillet only after you have understood the age-old narrative structures he violates. To enjoy the lexical inventions and distortions of Gatta, you need to know the rules of Italian and be familiar with the fine Tuscan of Pinocchio. I remember that when I was a child, I found myself in continual competition with a friend from an educated family who read Ariosto, and I spent what little money I had on a copy of Tasso from a second-hand bookstall to keep up with him. I dipped into it from time to time, but was secretly reading The Three Musketeers. The boy's mother, visiting our house one evening, spotted the incriminating book in the kitchen. Future men of letters did their reading in the kitchen, propped against a kitchen cupboard, with our mothers shouting at us that we would ruin our eyes and not at least go outside and get some fresh air. She was scandalized. But how can you read trash like this? That same lady, it should be said, told my mother that her idol was Wodehouse, whom I also used to read, and with great enjoyment, but, one lightweight author against another. Why was Wodehouse more noble than Dumas? A century-old sentence hung over the serialized